All right. Hello, hello. How is it going, folks? How is it going? Happy Tuesday. Glad to have you guys here. All right. All right. All right. All right. All right. I hope everybody is having a great Tuesday, a great start to their week. I'm going to go ahead and just jump right into things because we do have quite a bit that we need to get through in the next hour. So today, what we're going to be covering in this AP European History live review stream is French absolutism, or as I like to call it, the most important absolutism, because it is the quintessential absolutism in Europe. Okay. No, I'm just joking. All the other absolutist countries are also very important to know. But this one is definitely kind of like the stereotypical when you talk about absolutist Europe. You're going to talk about French absolutism. And of course, our boy, Louis XIV. Okay. I know that people, oh, Mr. Clancy, what's up? Glad to have you in here. I hope your stream went well. So I know that you guys, that we had some previous streams talking about absolutist Russia, and I know there was one that was on constitutionalism in Europe. So this is going to be kind of in that same vein. But like I said, this is focusing on France and kind of the quintessential European absolutism. So let's go ahead and jump right into it, because like I said, there is a lot we need to go ahead and cover. So let's go over to French absolutism. We're going to go into presenter view. Boom, chaka, laka. All right. Let's rock and roll. So can everybody see and hear me okay? We're all good over here. All right, perfect. So as we're going through here, if you have questions, make sure that you leave a comment or leave a question in the questions tab. Like I said, like I've said before, and like I'm sure you've heard if you tuned into Fiveable before, the questions tab is perfect because they've got all my questions in one place, and we can go through and I can talk about them each individually. All right. So today we are going to be covering the French absolutism, and I call it the rise of the Bourbons, because we are going to be talking about the first three Bourbon kings, the last monarchy or last royal family of France. Okay. So let's jump on in. First of all, of course, you have to make sure, if you're not already, and I know everybody at this point is following Fiveable on all the social medias, but make sure that you're doing it. Twitter, Instagram, and of course YouTube. And then that's my Twitter right there at the bottom if you want to give me a follow and say hello. But this is what we're going to be covering today, and as you can see, it is quite a bit. First of all, I will do a quick introduction that I'm doing now, and then we're going to talk about absolutism and the establishment of absolutism under Henry IV and Cardinal Richelieu. Then we'll talk about Louis XIV and his establishment of himself as an absolute king, and then mercantilism, the wars of Henry or of Louis XIV, and then we'll just go ahead and wrap things up. So we do have a long docket for today that I want to go ahead and just jump right into. So first, we have to talk about this guy here, Henry IV. So I know that if you studied the wars of religion, the French wars of religion, I'm sure you've already heard of this guy here, Henry IV, the first of the Bourbon kings. He was also the first Protestant king of France, although he's going to quickly convert to Catholicism, because according to Henry IV, Paris is worth a mass, and he knows that if he doesn't convert to Catholicism, he will never be taken seriously as king of France. But he is the first Bourbon king, and he's going to be doing a lot of stuff that is going to try to kind of get France and the French monarchy on that track towards absolutism. Okay. Now, first of all, Henry IV is just a very popular king. All right. He's a warrior king. He fought in the French Wars of Religions. He fought in the War of the Three Henries. All right. He has seen battle. He's seen war. And with that, he's made a lot of friends with his soldiers. He's made a lot of friends with the people. He's kind of seen as like this king protector. He's made good friends. He's made himself very popular. Okay. But he's also seen as just a very transparent king. He's seen as a king that can really relate to everybody. He's seen as sort of like this everyman, and he is going to really appeal to both the nobility and the peasantry. For the nobility, he is going to create new positions within the French government, and these are positions that you can buy. So you can buy your second son a position in the French government where he's going to make a nice salary. If you're wealthy enough, you can buy your way into the nobility. All right, and the nobility is going to be pretty jazzed about the fact that they can buy these new positions. The peasants are going to be happy because one of the things that Henry really tries to do is he tries to economically stabilize France, a very big undertaking that no one's really going to ever do, but Henry IV, he does a decent job of it, and he does a good enough job where the peasants are happy because the economy is stable, and if the economy is stable, they have food to eat, and if they have food to eat, the peasants are happy. Okay, so nobility likes him, peasants like him. He improves the infrastructure of France, and overall he starts to create this image of the king as the protector of the nation. Now, unfortunately for everybody, Henry IV is assassinated pretty early on in his reign in 1610. He's assassinated by a radical Catholic who comes up in the streets of Paris and stabs him in the chest. And as my students have often asked, where was his security? Well, it was an open carriage. But regardless, Henry IV is assassinated before he can really do anything else. Now, that brings us on to our second person here, and that is Cardinal Richelieu. Cardinal Richelieu, who is never actually a king. However, what he is king regent. All right, Louis XIII takes the throne at the tender age of 9 years old. Okay, and when he takes the throne, obviously he's too young to rule. And so whenever the king is too young to rule, someone rules in his stead, presumably until the king has reached a good enough age. All right, Cardinal Richelieu is that person. Unfortunately for Louis XIII, Cardinal Richelieu is never really going to let go of that power that he has. Okay, so Cardinal Richelieu, he is going to effectively be the one that's in control. He's going to be the chief advisor to Louis XIII. What that really means for here is that he's the one making all the decisions. Now, Cardinal Richelieu is going to make some pretty radical changes to the country and to the French monarchy. And his goal was really twofold. One, he wanted to increase the power and the prestige of the French monarchy in the country. Okay. But he also wanted to increase the power and the prestige of the French monarchy in Europe more generally. All right. And he's going to do this in a few ways. One, he's going to work on curbing the power of the nobility. And two, he's going to work on increasing continental power, specifically targeting Habsburgs. Okay. But this is Cardinal Richelieu. So talking a little bit more about him. Cardinal Richelieu, first and foremost, he centralizes excuse me, the government and curtailed the power of political groups. So first of all, Cardinal Richelieu, he sees the nobility more as a threat than someone like Henry IV did. Whereas Henry IV is just like, this is a group of people I need to keep happy. Cardinal Richelieu takes a much more Machiavellian approach where he says, no, we're going to stomp these people into the ground till they have no power. All right. And he does this in a few ways. One, Richelieu is going to disband all private armies. All right. This is really important because that's a lot of where the power of the nobility lay, was the fact that they had a private military. Also, this is where we see a transition to a much more nationalized army and a much more nationalized country. All right. So you have now a national standing French army as opposed to a bunch of other smaller private armies that the king would have to call up on. So he disbands the nobles' private armies. All right. He also disbands the private armies of The Huguenots. That's one of the things that Henry IV had given the Huguenots with the Edict of Nantes. The Edict of Nantes had not only given religious freedom, and I use that in quotes because it was minor religious freedom, not only had it given religious freedom to Huguenots, it had also given them some political freedom. They were a kind of like an independent group of people living within France. They had their own towns, they had their own armies, they had their own kind of political governmental systems. All right. Richelieu says, look, I don't care what religion you are, but what I do care about is the fact that you have private armies and political autonomy. We're going to take that away. Sorry, not sorry. All right. So he curtails the power of these political competition groups within France. He also divides up France into these 30 different districts that we can see on this map here. And these districts are going to be run by these people called intendants. Intendants are going to be, we can almost kind of think about them like states governors. They were in charge of that area. However, with these intendants, they did owe their allegiance to the monarchy. All right, so it's a way that the monarchy could control these individual areas of France without actually having to be there at all times. All right, which is going to be the big struggle of every king in history, is how do you control the areas that are way outside of your area of control? Okay. Now, of course, he is also going to take a very anti-Habsburg approach. Richelieu was introduced during the 30 Years' War, where he famously funded the Swedes and also sent some military troops into the Holy Roman Empire. Now, this anti-Habsburg approach was because Richelieu just looked at a map and said, oh, crap, we're surrounded by Habsburgs. So he takes a very anti-Habsburg foreign policy to try to achieve that balance of power in Europe. Okay. So that's Richelieu. All right. Richelieu, he is really, really important. He's an important figure to know. He's definitely someone you would want to know when understanding French absolutism. But he sets a lot of things up. Okay. And they could have all very well fallen apart depending on the next king. However, the next king is going to be Louis XIV. All right. Now, at the death of Richelieu in 1642, you're going to see a lot of things happening. Okay. First of all, the power and the prestige of the monarchy has gone up substantially. All right. The power of the nobility and the Huguenots, in contrast, though, had gone down substantially. Okay. They had also elevated France to the international stage. All right. France is now arguably the most powerful single country on the European continent. Okay. Certainly a country like England might rival them, but on all accounts, France is the most powerful country on the European continent. Okay. Also had generally speaking just made France a way more prestigious country in the eyes of Europeans and European leaders. Okay. However, on the flip side of all of this, he had created a lot of resentment from the nobility. The nobility really hated this guy. They hated what he was doing, and they hated the fact that a lot of their power was taken away. And with history, just like with everything else, for every action is an equal and opposite reaction. And that reaction is what we're going to call the Fronde. Okay. Now, when Louis XIII dies in 1643, he is going to pass the torch to Louis XIV. Now, just like young little Louis XIII, Louis XIV is quite young. He's 5 years old. All right. And when he takes the throne, obviously he's too young to rule. And Cardinal Richelieu's protege, Cardinal Mazarin, is going to take control as king regent. All right. But like I said, almost immediately the Fronde is going to break out. And this is the term given to a series of civil wars and uprisings orchestrated mostly by the nobility, but also by the peasants, targeted at the monarchy. All right. And it's a series of these civil uprisings. It's hard to call it a full-scale civil war, more of just civil uprisings, revolts, that's going to be focused on taking back power for the nobility. Now, this is very, very brutal. And we have to understand that this is happening when Louis is really, really young. He's a teenager here, okay, or young, not even a teenager here, and so he is growing up seeing the destruction and the death and the just general instability that the nobility was causing on France, and this is going to absolutely influence the kind of king that he will eventually be. All right. Now, Louis XIV is going to officially take office at the age of 23 when Cardinal Mazarin dies. Okay. And it was kind of just, more luck than anything else that Mazarin dies when Louis XIV is still relatively young, but at a good age to rule. But when he takes the throne, he kind of has some ideas in his head of the kind of king he wants to be. He had seen the destruction and he had seen the death of the Fronde and he had seen the problems that it had caused France. And he says, this is just not going to happen. This is not going to do. I cannot be a king that rules over such an unruly group of people. So he knows that the best way to secure security in France is through absolutism. All right. And Louis XIV would be the first to tell you, he's not the smartest guy in the room ever. He's not he doesn't have that natural brightness or that natural IQ that other rulers might have. But he is probably the hardest working monarchy, one of the hardest working monarchies in history. And he is going to work relentlessly to make up for that general lack of IQ. All right. He is also going to work very, very hard to surround himself with people that are going to be more than just yes man. They're going to be people that are going to actually make sure that he is successful as king of France. All right. So this is Louis XIV. All right. So let's talk a little bit more about him here. I do want to talk a little bit about how he hopes to really achieve that absolutism that he works so hard to get to. So he did attempt to establish this absolute monarchy, this absolute rule, in order to heighten the French prestige on the continent, but also to bring economic and social prosperity to France. And he really does that by making sure that he's in the middle of everything. He wants to make sure that anything that happens in his country has his fingerprints on it somewhere. He wants to make sure that everything that happens in his country is first consulted with by him, or with him. You know what I mean. He is going to earn the nickname the Sun King. This is mostly due to the fact that when he was a younger child, he portrayed the sun in several different theater productions that he was in, and he kind of earned this nickname. But it's a pretty appropriate nickname for him because he really is the center of everything, and his light shine down on everything in France. Now he is going to follow three strategies to attempt establishing absolutism in France, or as he would put it, to three strategies to make sure he never becomes a king of straw or a king of nothing. All right. And the first and probably the most prevalent that we're going to see is his absolutist propaganda. This guy and his advisors were masters of propaganda. Okay. And they use this propaganda to create a really succinct image of Louis. They wanted him to look a certain way, and they wanted his presence to convey a certain feeling among French citizens. And this is done in several different ways. All right. This way that we'll look at right here is the way that he's portrayed in portraits and in artwork. All right. This being probably the most famous. You can see he's got the sword on his hip, suggesting that he is a warrior. He's wearing the Bourbon colors, but he's also looking very lavish. He's looking very royal and prestigious. He's got good posture. He's standing up straight. He just looks royal. And in a lot of ways, he looks angelic, otherworldly. All right. And that is absolutely what they're going for here. They want to make him seem like he's larger than life in a lot of ways. Now, Louis is also going to make sure that he keeps the nobility in check. All right. But unlike Richelieu, Louis is not really going to favor the stick method, right? He's not going to be favoring the we're going to stomp the nobility in the ground until they have nothing left method. That was Richelieu's method. It's not going to work for Louis. Louis instead says we're going to kill the nobility with kindness. We are going to take the carrot method approach. All right. And a lot of this is kind of created physically in the building of the Palace of Versailles. The Palace of Versailles, probably the most legendary palace in the world. It built just outside of the city of Paris, a few miles away. Far enough away, though, where Louis could separate himself from the rabble and the commons of France and of Paris. And it is going to be probably the most impressive, one of the most impressive structures in Europe. And it's going to be copied and emulated throughout the world. But it's going to become the center of French government. It's going to become the center of the Bourbon monarchy. It's going to become the center of everything. All right. And this palace not only served as a place for Louis to reside, but also a place for the nobility to reside, right? A place where people could come visit and see the monarchy. All right. And this was a very, very impressive palace. It was an impressive structure. It's massive. It's huge. It's got rooms upon rooms upon rooms. It's got fountains all over the place, fountains that are hidden in the gardens, fountains that are front and center. It's got beautiful, beautiful fountains. It also has beautiful, beautiful gardens. And that's kind of one of the biggest features here. In fact, if you go to visit Versailles today, you're going to be spending like 75% of your time walking around the gardens. The gardens are amazing. All right. But there was absolutely a larger than life aspect to it, or larger than life feeling to it, that really other palaces, other places in Europe might just have been missing, with really just absolutely royal and ornate and beautiful and beautiful rooms. And you can see the bedrooms there on the right hand side that were just absolutely larger than life. Just in general, a very larger than life palace, larger than life place. A palace that came with its own chapel, a palace that came with its own opera house. I mean, this thing had everything. All right. And all of this served to be this kind of central location where Louis can reside, where he can abode. I mean, this was supposed to be the center of French government and the center of France. And really this was meant to be also a tourist attraction. They would open up Versailles for several hours a day, where people could come in and they could see maybe a glimpse of the king. Maybe they could catch a glimpse of him, but just to be there in the presence was supposed to be, it was almost like this like religious experience. And that's exactly what Louis was trying to go for. He wants people to think that he's divine, and he is almost godlike. But like I said, this is just a very, very impressive palace, massive palace. But when you create something this big, it is obviously going to have some repercussions. When there is these massive economic divides where you can build something like this, but you still have your people starving in the streets, it's going to create some problems down the road. And that's what we will look at here in just a few weeks with the French Revolution. A lot of the early French Revolution is focused on things like Versailles. Okay. But the nobility were absolutely controlled by Versailles as much as they were dazzled by it. Okay. Versailles was an area where you would go and you would have to spend time at. All right. All the major noble families were required to spend a certain portion of their year at Versailles, where they would be in the presence of the king. And there were all these traditions that were created for the king waking up and the king going to bed and the king brushing his teeth and going to chapel and, yada, 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 yada. All of these traditions where you would have nobles that would earn the privilege to be a part of them. All right. It was a great honor to watch the king go to sleep every night, or to be by his bedside when he woke up. All right. And as weird and as archaic as that is, it created this sense of like elegance and the sense of real like prestige that you could earn if you were loyal enough to Louis. All right. So again, this carrot method for the nobility of keeping the nobility in line and in check. Now, the third way that Louis attempted to achieve absolutism in France is through religious conformity. All right. And Louis XIV does revoke the Edict of Nantes. And this is going to be very questionable by a lot of people at the time, and certainly a lot of historians looking back on this as being one of Louis's great mistakes. Religious conformity. Louis believes that in order to achieve peace and harmony and balance in France, there can only be one religion that exists there. And because Louis is a Bourbon, and because he's a French king, Louis is going to choose Catholicism as the ruling religion of France. Most, by when I mean most, I mean like upwards of 90% of France, if not more, is Catholic. So it makes sense. But the revocation of the Edict of Nantes is going to create a lot of religious tension in France, and a lot of Huguenots are going to flee France at this time. A lot of them heading to the Americas, but also a substantial portion heading to areas like the Dutch Republic, Switzerland, England, Scotland. And but this can be seen as kind of one of Louis' great failures, because we can look back and we know that religion, that trying to force religious conformity like this ends up just creating a lot more problems. And you would think Louis would learn that from the wars of religion, but obviously he did not. Now, Louis himself as a person really could probably care less about what religion you are. He was way more concerned with the stability of his country. However, he does believe that religious conformity like this, and there only being one religion, he does believe that is truly important for stability in France. So there we go. Now, those are the three ways that he attempts to achieve absolutism, and the three ways that he attempts to enforce absolutism on to France. And like I said, the propaganda was very successful. The religious conformity, not so much. All right. But overall, we would say when we look at Louis and how he was success-wise as an absolute king, he's seen as like the model absolute king in European history. All right. And domestically, he does make a lot of strides. And we can look at a lot of his domestic success with this guy here, Jean-Baptiste Colbert. Jean-Baptiste Colbert being the chief finance minister for Louis XIV during most of his rule. All right. And Jean-Baptiste Colbert is going to be a strict mercantilist. Now, mercantilism, this is old hat for us at this point. We've talked about mercantilism at length during the Age of Exploration. Mercantilism being the economic theory that a country's power is measured by their wealth, usually in gold and silver. And what this is going to do, it's going to encourage countries to export and not really import, or to produce a lot within their country, but to place high tariffs on imported goods, right? If you're in France, you're buying French goods and you're producing stuff that it's going to be sold to French citizens. And Jean-Baptiste Colbert is going to be very good at this. And he's going to be doing a lot of different things here in conjunction with Louis XIV that's going to bring some economic prosperity to England. One, he's going to establish and promote French industries, whether that's establishing new French industries or whether that's just securing the industries that already existed within France. And he's going to do this with pretty moderate success. Industry thrives under Colbert and Louis XIV. It really, really does. And this is going to kind of be our precursor to the agricultural and later on industrial revolutions, is that industry really starts to become secure in France. He's also going to heavily regulate trade. Colonies played a key role in mercantilism, and the relationship that colonies had with their home country was very important here. And so the idea is that you produce all of your goods in-house, right? Your raw goods are produced in your colonies, your finished goods are produced in the home country, and then those finished goods are sold to your colonies. They're sold within your home country, and if you've got enough left, you export them. You sell them to other countries too, okay? So Colbert is going to really regulate that kind of in-house trading. He's also going to really regulate the foreign trade, okay? So yeah, you're trying to export as much as you can, but you're importing as little as possible. You don't want to actually spend money on goods that aren't French because that money is then leaving the country. So if you're importing goods, you're going to place high tariffs on them. All right, so for example, if I'm French and I really want some rice, I might have to buy that rice from an English or a Spanish plantation, an English or from England or from Spain. All right. That rice is going to be really expensive because it's imported. Okay. There's going to be a high tariff that's placed on this. I might be more inclined to just buy French wheat and make bread as opposed to having rice. All right. Because odds are that wheat's going to be a little bit cheaper because it was made in house. All right. And that's really mercantilism 101 right there. Mercantilism is going to eventually feed its way into capitalism, which we'll talk way more about with agricultural revolution. And we've talked a little bit about already. But mercantilism is the going economic theory of the 1600s for sure. Okay. Now, Colbert is also going to work hard to finance arts and sciences. It's going to start to create this idea that France is the scientific and artistic capital of the world. And certainly by the time we get to the 1700s and the Age of Enlightenment, Paris is the educational center of Europe, far and away. Everybody goes to Paris to go to the salons and to talk about Enlightenment theory. And a lot of that we can kind of credit with Colbert for financing these arts and financing these sciences. But that's Jean-Baptiste Colbert. I guarantee you're going to see him. I guarantee you're going to see him in class, and I guarantee you're going to see him on the AP exam because Jean-Baptiste Colbert, besides maybe Jacques Necker, is the most important finance minister in European history. All right, just a very, very important guy overall, and very successful in what he does. All right, so that's the domestic side of Louis XIV and his rule. Now, on paper, Louis XIV is looking good so far. All right, he's looking successful. He's looking like he's going to lead France into a golden age of economic and social prosperity. However, Louis XIV is going to mess up real hard the last 30 years of his rule. All right, and that is because Louis XIV is engaged in constant warfare for just about the last 30 years of his rule. He's going to be involved in 4 major wars here, okay? The first 3 are relatively important, but they're not super important because their impacts aren't that substantial. However, the last war that we talk about, I am going to spend some time with talking about here because it has some really, really big implications. Now, being the good European continental king that Louis is, he has to stick his hand in some pies. He has to stick his nose in business that isn't his. That's kind of just the going theme of the 16 and the 1700s. And a lot of that is going to boil down to these wars that kind of just seem petty and meaningless. But these wars were about increasing continental prestige and continental power. What they're really going to result in is just massive casualties and not that much land gain. All right. Louis XIV and his foreign policy is seen as a failure. He's seen as a failure there because it really doesn't do all that much for France in the long run. All right. Now, obviously, there are going to be some big impacts here that we got to talk about. But in terms of is France a better country after Louis XIV than it was before Louis XIV? A lot of that's up for the debate because of these wars that he gets France in. All right. All that economic prosperity that Colbert had attempted to establish, a lot of that's going to be squandered on these petty, meaningless wars. All right. And like I said, there are 4 main wars that we need to look at here that Louis is involved in for that 30-year time period at the end of his rule. Okay. The war first is the War of Devolution. And the War of Devolution was focused on the Spanish Netherlands. The last time we left the Spanish Netherlands, they had just seceded from Netherlands proper, and they had seceded from the Netherlands proper, and they had kind of just wandered back to Spain. Eventually, the Spanish Netherlands are today going to be Belgium. The Dutch Republic is the Dutch Republic, or the Netherlands, excuse me. But the Spanish Netherlands are kind of this very tempting piece of land for Louis. I mean, they're right on the border, and there's some decent farmland there. On top of that, it's a nice little buffer zone for France and the Dutch Republic. So Louis sees this and he says, "This looks pretty good." And so Louis is going to be involved in this year-long conflict to attempt to scrape some of that land away from the Spanish Netherlands. Largely unsuccessful here, though. He only gets minor land gains that we can see right there. And the French aren't going to really hold on to those either. So short war, but no real major consequences either way for that one. However, what this does is it shows Europe and European countries that Louis is hungry and that he is on the prowl for more territory for France. So the European countries start getting a little nervous. Remember, we're only about 20 years past the 30 Years' War. Europe is in no means or no way ready to get involved in another massive war, and certainly with a king as I'll say as big, larger than life as Louis is. So the next war, and this one is going to be definitely more significant, is the Franco-Dutch War, which lasts between 1672 and 1679. So just a few years after the War of Devolution. And this is focused on really just attempting to economically neuter the Dutch. The Dutch at this time are smack dab in the middle of the Dutch Golden Age. The Dutch Golden Age being the kind of the height of economic prosperity for the Netherlands, where they controlled the spice trade in India, and were just really economically running the country. They were the banking center of Europe. Excuse me. They were the banking center of Europe. They were doing quite well for themselves. And the Dutch were the biggest economic adversary on the continent to the Netherlands. There was really no other two countries on the European continent that were quite as economically successful as these two were. And so because of that, Louis is going to look at the Dutch and say, okay, we need to weaken them. We need to weaken their power on the continent so that we can scoop up some of that economic prosperity for ourselves. Okay, a decent plan maybe, but Louis is going to really just massively overcommit here. And again, generally unsuccessful. Not much happens here. All Louis does is that he really, really ticks off the rest of Europe. Several European countries actually end up joining with the Netherlands, with the Dutch Republic, to push back Louis XIV because they see him upsetting the balance of power that they had worked so hard to establish during the 30 Years' War with the Peace of Westphalia. All right. So they see this guy as upsetting the balance of power, and they want to stop him. And that's where we get the end of the Franco-Dutch War. Okay. So at this point, if Louis had decided that this is enough war for him and he had backed away, maybe things would have been different. All right. But the next two wars are really going to just be the icing on the cake here. All right, so the 9 Years' War, 1688 to 1697 here. This is a war that's really going to be focused on the fact that Louis XIV is getting too big for his britches. Several countries in Europe are going to band together to try to push back Louis and his attempts to claim land specifically in the Holy Roman Empire. Okay. And again, this is going to result in very, very minor land gains. All right. But it's going to be a lot of bloodshed, and it's going to be a lot of money wasted. All right. Wars are expensive here. All right. But the last war, Like I said, the first three wars, relatively important, but their consequences and their outcome aren't necessarily the most important thing here. The last war, though, I think is probably the most important war in the 1600s, past the 30 Years' War, obviously. 30 Years' War, the most important war in the 1600s. But the next war that we talk about here, I think, is probably the second most important war, and that is the War of Spanish Succession. All right, the War of the Spanish Succession is going to have massive consequences both for France and for the rest of Europe here. All right, it's going to last for just about 12 years and is also going to last pretty much up until Louis's death. Louis dies in 1715. So it's going to last a essentially longer amount than the other wars, and it's going to have very big consequences. All right, and to set this war up, we got to talk about Spain quickly, who we haven't talked about in quite some time, because honestly, Spain kind of economically bankrupted themselves. They had spent way too much money on fighting wars of religion, and they had spent way too much resources trying to get more resources, that they were just in very bad, dire economic shape. And on top of that, their leadership wasn't necessarily the best. Remember, the Spanish had been ruled by the Habsburg family, the Spanish Habsburg line. All right. And the last of our Spanish Habsburgs is Charles II, who we can see here. And Charles II, he has a whole host of mental and physical issues that he's dealing with since birth, and he physically can't have kids. And so when he dies, he obviously dies without an heir, and there's not really a logical person to take the throne. And there are lots of people whose names are kind of put into the ring to be the next king of Spain. One of those people is Louis XIV grandson, Philip d'Anjou. And Philip here, who is a Bourbon, his name is brought up to be the next king of Spain. Now, if you're Louis, you really, really like this idea, because one of your big goals from the get-go was curb power of the Habsburgs. So the idea of a Bourbon sitting on the Spanish throne, that sounds pretty sweet. You also like the idea that, hey, this might be sort of like a alliance that we can strike up between Spain and France. And then if you're France, you don't have to worry about your neighbors to the west, right? Because you know you can trust them, their family. That doesn't always work. Family doesn't really mean a whole lot in European politics. But regardless, for Louis, it seems pretty sweet. Certainly beats the Habsburgs anyway. If you're anybody else in Europe, this is a really, really, really bad idea. France had already proven that they were a country that was aggressive, and that they were a country that it really could care less about balance of power in Europe. All right. And now here they are talking about, let's put a Bourbon on the throne. Bad news bears. All right. And in fact, in order to stop Louis XIV from doing this, a grand alliance is formed. And I love when grand alliances are formed in history, because I think that they're hilarious when every single other country in Europe joins together to stop you. All right. Very rarely in history does every country in Europe agree on anything. Only time it really happens is when they're trying to stop somebody. All right. We're going to see this again with someone like Napoleon or France during the French Revolution. It's funny that it's always France, isn't it? Anyway, Austria, Denmark, Portugal, the Holy Roman Empire, England, and the Dutch Republic are all going to say, we got to stop this guy from putting his grandson on the throne. All right. Again, this is all focused on this idea of balance of power. We cannot allow France to have this much power on the continent. It's going to be bad news bears for everybody. Okay. And so they joined together to stop them. And what's going to result is a 12-year conflict and war between France and this grand alliance. Now, France is going to eventually put Philip on the throne. He's going to become Philip V of France, or Philip V of Spain, excuse me. However, it comes at massive, massive, massive cost to France. First of all, they just fought a 12-year war. That's really long. Okay, that not only is that really long, They were involved for that whole thing. So they were fighting for 12 years, all right? It's not like the 30-year war where you had countries jumping in and out of it. This is one country fighting for 12 years. They burn a lot of money and they burn a lot of manpower to do it. Okay? And then finally, when the Treaty of Utrecht comes around, okay, and this is a treaty that is for sure need to know. When the Treaty of Utrecht comes around, it comes around with pretty dire consequences, and consequences that France is going to be feeling for really the rest of history. Okay, so first of all, and something I would say is probably the most important, is one of those really, really sweet things that you get if you have Spain is you get the Strait of Gibraltar. Gibraltar is the strait that is between Europe and Africa, between just south of Spain, excuse me. And so if you're Spain, you want to control that because you control the only entrance between the Atlantic Ocean and the Mediterranean Sea. Pretty sweet. Gibraltar is going to be given to England in the Treaty of Utrecht. This is dicey for a lot of different reasons. First of all, this is going to secure the fact that England is eventually going to be the most powerful economic country in Europe. They're also going to have the most powerful navy. So this is just kind of bad news bears on that front. And also, Spain has kind of lost the one really big thing that it had. Okay, so that's a really, really big downside for Louis. Huge upside for England. Like I said, England's going to walk away feeling pretty good about this. Secondly, Naples, the Spanish Netherlands, and territory in northern Italy is going to Austria. Okay. Again, you're losing a lot of really, really important territory here that you've worked hard to try to get. And historically speaking, this is going to have a lot of consequences too. Austria is going to work very, very hard to hold on to that Italian territory. They're going to hold on to that to that Italian territory, really until Italy is unified in 1861. Okay, so they're going to hold on to that territory for quite some time. And it's a really, economically speaking, it's more farmland. Economically speaking, it's more resources. And France loses it through this treaty. Okay. Also, several of the French claims in North America are going to go to England. Nova Scotia, Hudson Bay, several other areas in like the Canadian area are going to go to England. So France loses a lot of that. Again, that economic resources that they had with their colonies in North America, they're gone. Okay, so massive, massive consequences of the Treaty of Utrecht. But I mean, I guess France gets a Bourbon on the Spanish throne, and thus starts the Spanish Burma dynasty. But is it really worth it? And that's kind of the big question here. I would say probably not. Even just losing the Strait of Gibraltar, I don't think it's really worth it all that much at that point. Spain, economically, they're not in great shape. Okay, are they a potential ally to your west or to your south? Yeah, for sure. But you still have Portugal to contend with, and Spain doesn't really have the army to support you. So this is, in my opinion, anyway, in the opinion of a lot of other people, this is a huge negative for Louis. This is a huge strike against him. The War of Spanish Succession and the Treaty of Utrecht that followed it. Okay, but Treaty of Utrecht, that's a need to know. All right, so we are nearing the end here. Let's go ahead and wrap it up. We moved through that incredibly fast. Let's talk about the legacy of Louis XIV, and this is where I'm going to leave you guys today. Okay, so was Louis XIV a successful absolutist king? That's the big question. It's a question that, doesn't really have a yes or no answer. Okay, like most things in this class. Louis dies in 1715. At a very, very old age, after a very, very long rule. By the time that he dies, he's pretty unpopular. A lot of that early popularity, a lot of the charm and the general prestige and wow that Louis XIV had is gone. And we can kind of blame his wars for that. People don't like being at war, and certainly war that lasts for upwards of 30 years. But it's hard to say if he was successful or if he was unsuccessful. Certainly his domestic policy was very successful. France is going to be the most prestigious country in Europe after the death of Louis XIV. They are going to be an economic, and they are going to be a social and artistic and scientific center of Europe. They are going to be really one of the most powerful countries in the world. But they've also racked up a substantial amount of debt. They've also made a lot of enemies on the continent. They have also hounded their people for taxes and for military service and all sorts of things. So, Louis XIV, was he a successful king? He was certainly an important king. He was certainly bombastic, and he was certainly did a lot for the country of France, but not all that was good. That's kind of the big takeaway here, is that Louis XIV, while he is known as the absolutist king and the poster child for an absolute monarchy, he makes a lot of mistakes along the way. And the big takeaway here, I think, is that no absolute king is going to be truly absolute. No absolute king is going to be able to do everything they set out to do. Okay, you can look at someone like Peter the Great. Peter the Great is going to attempt to plunge Russia out of the depths of the Middle Ages into the modern era. And he does that minorly successfully, but he's going to create a lot of social strife and problems upon his death. He didn't get rid of feudalism. Russia is still a largely feudal and economically despaired country upon his death. Okay, Peter wasn't a perfect absolute king, just like Louis wasn't a perfect absolute king. And that's kind of the big takeaway here. Now, the other issue is that Louis XIV, love him or hate him, he was a pretty darn good king in terms of just all the stuff that you need to be able to do when you're king. He was a hard worker. He was able to surround himself with good advisors. He was able to secure power for himself and for the monarchy and for France. All right. And he lived for a really long time, which that's not nothing. Living for a really long time usually means you're going to get a lot of stuff done. Some kings are able to get a lot of stuff done in a short period of time. Most aren't, though. And so that was really helpful. Unfortunately for Louis, though, the two kings that follow him are not going to be anything special. And that's the issue here. He's going to be followed by two very, very mediocre kings. His great-grandson, and it is his great-grandson because you better believe he outlives his son and his grandson. His great-grandson, who becomes Louis XV, is going to be very, very mediocre. He's not going to be able to carry the same weight of absolutism that his great-grandfather did. And then Louis XV's grandson, Louis XVI, is going to have a lot of issues as well. Namely, he's just very mediocre at a time where France couldn't afford to have a mediocre king. And he is going to be the king that lives and dies through the French Revolution. All right. So Louis XIV, model of absolutism, but that doesn't come without some major problems. All right. So that is it. That is French absolutism. I know that's kind of a quick pace through it. It's one of the centerpieces of this time period, but it's easy to know. It's easy to understand, I think. If you want some practice with that, you can go and check out some of the past exam questions. There was a DBQ on Louis XIV that is really, really good that I think is from 2017. I can actually go look real quick. And we can go see what year it was from. But certainly College Board loves to talk about Louis XIV and everything that he did. And they love to throw in questions on the exam. So I would definitely, I would go check out, some past questions about him. I believe it was 2017, although I could very well be wrong here. No, it was not 2017. Could it be 2016? I'll check. If not, I'll just go ahead and wrap things up. Yeah, it was in 2016. One of the past DBQ questions did have Louis XIV, and the question was Louis XIV an absolute king, or did he have the traits of an absolute king? But you can find plenty of past exam questions on Louis XIV and on absolutist France. But that is it for me for today. I'm going to go ahead and wrap things up. If there are any other questions that you have for me, you can go ahead and throw them in there, and I can answer them. I appreciate you guys hanging out with me today. I appreciate you guys tuning in. And like I said, if you have any questions for me, you can follow me on Twitter, shoot me a question there, or you can hop into to my next stream. I'm always happy to answer past questions as well as current questions. So feel free to do that. But I appreciate you guys tuning in to the stream. Like I said, if you have any questions, I'm going to stick around here for a minute, and I can go ahead and answer them. But I hope you guys have a great Tuesday night, and you have a great rest of your week and a good weekend. All right, guys, I'm going to go ahead and end it. Have a great night, and I will see you guys next time.